start.
Do people actually watch on Twitch?
I think some do, but we are live. So hello to those who are watching. We've got a confronting morning ahead of us. Some of us are waking up to see the changes that are happening afoot in the US and wondering what is going on. So we're having a discussion, which I thought we'd share with you, of what is happening in the US. Trying to understand so much of it. And this is not going to be a top-down discussion. If you're looking for, here's what's happening and here's what to think, you've got plenty of large, live MSNBC, CNN, and Fox News to tell you, here's what's going on. We're trying to learn.
Besides, if you know what to think, you probably wouldn't be watching this anyway.
So we've got on a phone call, one, Samrat.
Hello. Yeah.
And next to me is...
Hi guys, I'm Edwina D. You can find me on Twitter and Facebook and stuff under that name. We should probably explain our context. Obviously, you know who Chris Coveries is. Samrat, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah,
Please.
I guess I'm a Christian first and foremost and a political activist secondly. You can find me at almost any right-wing rally in Sydney. That's about it.
I'm Edwina. I am a former left-wing, come centrist, now current right-wing gender traitor, sitting down to kind of have a conversation with you guys about what's been going on politically, because I woke up to a firestorm on my Facebook and Twitter and everywhere else this morning about what had happened in Washington overnight. And there seems to be just like a lot of anger and much less reasoning than I would have expected. So I was invited to sit down and have a chat and talk about some of the whys. Because obviously this is unprecedented in our lifetimes.
So if you're just joining us trying to understand what's happening, this is what we're looking at. The beginnings of what was an occupation of the US Capitol by what started as a protest but clearly turned into something else.
Did it turn into something else though? That's the argument. I've had people tell me this morning that it was a coup, which generally you need guns and military, and it's like Pinochet, so I question that. That it was a deliberate organized movement that had a website. I asked for a source of the website and wasn't able to get one. That it was a deliberate attempt by Donald Trump to use the people as an army, and that it was like 1733 when people came into Washington. I'm not entirely sure of that reference. And also that it was actually just, Republicans saying that there was so much voter fraud they weren't willing to put up with. So it really depends on who you ask as to what this actually was.
On that topic, Samrat, what do you think, or what do you understand so far has happened this morning?
So, as you're counting the Arizona votes, you're having the 2-hour debates on that. The protests outside the Capitol developed a sort of mob mentality. The one person steps forward and shouts something, all of a sudden, the entire section of the crowd pushed through the fences and into the US Capitol building. And then obviously Congress had to vacate, went into a mini shutdown, lockdown, and then everyone else who was not meant to be there was escorted out by the police and National Guard.
So how we got to that point is where we get to the outside here, and this is probably one of the largest ones that's been streamed there. I'm not even a few seconds in, and I want to pause here on what we can see in one of the largest shared videos that I've seen, which go up into the millions, which is a large crowd of thousands, 10,000 plus. Beyond those numbers, it's very hard to work out what a number is beyond 10,000. It's just innumerable. Being held back from the Capitol by a line of police, some with shields, so we'll call them riot police, trying to force their way into the Capitol building. What do you see, Joanna?
Honestly, I see it beginning to escalate. The people who are trying to force their way in, it's actually a very small number to begin with. When this started out, from the videos I've seen, people kind of stood behind their lines with their flags and shouted, "Yay, President Trump, make America great again, this is fraud." And then it escalated from there. I will say that if they truly wanted to subdue the crowd, there's like 5 cops on that line. Whoever was behind the organization of the anti-protest, when you look at a lot of the entrances into the Capitol building, it is 10 to 15 to 20 to 30 to 5,000. If you actually wanted to prevent this with force, it almost feels to me like emotional manipulation. It's intended to make it look that the protest turned violent and took over, the law enforcement and push the law enforcement people down. Some other videos I've seen they knocked down law enforcement and then stopped to help the lady policeman up from where she'd fallen on the stairs. And I'm not saying this makes them the best people in the world or anything like that, but I've been hearing from people all morning saying there are pipe bombs, they were standing there holding automatic weapons. Yes, there was an automatic weapon seized from a van parked away from the site. I can't see anyone in this crowd holding guns, and certainly don't see Molotov cocktails and weapons, whereas any day of the week, in the last 182 days, I could log in and see people throwing Molotovs at the courthouse in Portland. So what we actually end up with here is that people are approaching this as if it's a moral problem. My politics are better than your politics, therefore your actions are worse than mine in the same context. And the other message that I was kind of taking away is that there's a deep amount of American offense at the idea of going into the Capitol building compared to raiding anywhere else they could have picked, which I actually don't understand culturally. But looking at what's going on, the medium as the message is very true, and the news has jumped on the idea that all of these people are terrible people, and I think they're probably ordinary people just like us.
I think there's a lot there, and that's what we're trying to discuss with those who are watching along, in trying to unpack what does all this mean. And as someone who covers a lot of protests firsthand, my first reaction to it was, yeah, this is normal. This is our new normal. This kind of, what I'm sharing on screen here, this kind of political violence has been our normal for months now. What's so different now that it's in a Capitol building from a federal court, from apartment buildings, from universities? In the US, they get caught on fire. Here, people just walk into them and mess up desks. Videos of parliamentary offices that have been destroyed. Okay, that's the same as the vice chancellors. What's new here? I was waiting to hear that Captain of the Army, John Shmoo, says that he's going to honorably enforce the election. Wow, that's huge. Whoa. Person in a position of power. These are random, but idiots being stupid and forcing their way into places that they're not permitted. This happens. This is our language of violence. I'm going to turn back to you, Summer, and say, we're looking at some property damage here. A broken window. What do you reckon?
Yeah, look, you have to compare it to what they're trying to protest against. And I think, they're obviously, should you be damaging property? No. But then, does breaking a window compare to the, what's being accused as... Oh, what's that? Oh, sorry, just sent me a notification. Does compare to the issue, which is that US democracy has been undermined. And if breaking a window and protesting and storming the Capitol is a way to defend democracy, you've got to weigh those up and say, is it an appropriate response to an undermining of the government?
Yeah. Okay, so that's where we've gone beyond the point earlier, which I was saying, violence is just part of normal political discourse. We've reached the point you've gone, now, if violence is a normal part of political discourse, is the violence proportionate? See, your point has already gone beyond that violence is part of political discussion. You've gone, yeah, that's already done. Now it's just about proportionality of it rather than any amount. And that's fascinating that we've started 2021 in there, isn't it?
But we've lost our...
backtrack a bit. Mm-hmm. We can backtrack a bit and look at what led up to it. So I don't think that you can just jump from one point to using violence in your protest without going through all the steps in between. So if you look at Black Lives Matter, for instance, they kind of just emerged out of nowhere using violence to push their point. if you look at the Trump camp, you see there was a whole legal process before that. There was many peaceful options exhausted, and with the Congress vote happening now and that seemingly falling apart, they've exhausted all the points of not using violence, and now they've come to the point where violence is the only option. So they've gone through the process, unlike many other political movements in the Western world at the moment.
I kind of agree with you. I would also put forward that seeing a lot of protests now, there is a definite body language that tends to accompany people who have planned organized violence, where they intend to hurt, push, intimidate, or bully other people. As far as many of the protests that I've looked at this year, the body language here is fairly laconic. They're all flowing forward quite slowly. They don't have their bodies in offensive positions. Where there's 7 minutes of this, and I think we clock 2 punches in that whole time. It feels like these people are more of a force of sheer mass than people who organized, got together and said, let's go shoot up the Capitol building. And I also think that there are people who are very confused, and that it rolls into a larger issue, which is that our news media organizations are no longer trustworthy. Opening my Reddit news feed this morning, I had The Atlantic, The Guardian, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal all saying remove Trump from office, impeach Trump, arrest the protesters. And that was at the top of my news feed. They have taken this view that news is no longer a recount of events, but is instead definitely a partisan political issue. And when you reach that point, you end up with entire swathes of your population who believe nothing that comes out of certain people's mouths. And when that happens, you lose any real connection to the truth, because there's no nuance. There's only the person whose news that aligns with your personal belief. And a good example of that is I was having a conversation earlier today on Facebook with someone who I generally get along very well with. But I was saying, I think the issue with a lot of this is that you feel manipulated, but you are being manipulated. You are how you feel about it is being used against you rather than your politics winning. And my friend's response was, yes, Donald Trump has done that. And what I said was, they have all done that. I don't know if you guys recall, but Nancy Pelosi stood up on the news and essentially said that Black Lives Matter should light Portland on fire as long as it takes to get the demands met. President Trump is not the only politician who has incited violence in the last year, and behaving like he is ridiculous and infantile, but we are. And I would like to point out that I don't even like Trump that much, but this whole different laws for you and me depending on what your level of privilege is, that's not equality or equity. It doesn't achieve anything.
Samrat,
Yes.
the guys who occupied the Capitol, what do they want?
So to answer that question, you kind of have to look at the broader Trump camp and why Trump won't concede. And then you'll start to understand why his supporters will go to any lengths to make sure he does get back in office. So the first point on that is to go back all the way to 2016. And you remember Billy Graham, yeah? Legendary preacher, crusades, rallies everywhere, UK, Australia. So his son, Franklin Graham, in 2016 said, once Trump had won, that Trump was put in office by God. And that's the key to understanding the whole Trump mindset. So I'm going to list a few people, and these people are part of the charismatic Pentecostal evangelical movement in America, and they identify as prophets, as people who receive revelation from God. So you got Chuck Pierce from Gloria Zion, Bill Johnson, Paula Kane White, who's the chair of Trump's Evangelical Advisory Board, Benny Johnson, who's the head of Bethel Church, one of the biggest Pentecostal churches in America, Sid Roth, Jeremy Johnson, the list goes on, of heads of Christian churches who have all said that they have received revelation from God that come January 20th, Trump will be the next president. And that's the mindset behind this, pro-Trump movement, is that the Pentecostal charismatic movement is fighting not on, ideological grounds of, this is Republicans versus Democrats. And they're not even fighting based on the kind of rules of this reality and understanding. They're coming from a parallel reality, if you will, where their understanding is God has chosen Trump to be the next president again, and whatever happens, God will do that. And so when it came to counting the ballots today, the electors today in Congress, and obviously that's gone towards Biden, the mindset is that even if Biden is certified by the Congress, God's going to find a way to put Trump back in, and that's the motivation for these people. So out of America's, I think 60 to 70% are identified as Christian, almost 40% broadly Christian. I mean, if you look at the exact numbers, it's about 45% Protestant, 20% Catholic. But of that, almost 30 to 40% of Americans also identify as charismatic Pentecostals, which means that they have spiritual leaders who are all in agreement that God has chosen Trump to put back into office.
So
And
you're
the
saying,
majority of Trump's...
sorry
Yep.
to do the media put words in your mouth, but so you're saying that this is as much a political uprising as it is a religious uprising. Would I
Yes.
be?
So you remember
Yeah.
Lynn Wood, the attorney that was supporting Trump cases across the US?
No, tell us more.
Attorney Lynn Wood. So who was that other lady that the woman that everyone was talking about running Trump cases? Oh, her name just slipped my mind.
I'm working on that. Lynn Wood, a political commentator, personal injury lawyer, and now, well, Google describes him as a conspiracy theorist, but yeah, he's...
Everyone's a conspiracy theorist. Welcome to 2021.
yeah, it does
So
seem that
he
way.
was working with the other pro-Trump lawyer trying to overturn elections. So Lynn Wood gave a speech a couple weeks back where he described the fight against Joe Biden as us marching into Jericho and waiting for the walls to come crumbling down to seize the city. And so that's the kind of rhetoric coming from the top Republicans and top attorneys fighting for Trump. And so it really is a religious battle as opposed to an ideological one.
So it's a little bit like the same way that George Bush seized the evangelical vote and won against Al Gore with that really close percentage. Interesting. I didn't know that so much of America would have described itself as a charismatic Pentecostal. That's
It is, yeah. I mean, when George Bush was around, the second George Bush, I think Pentecostals were edging around 20-25%. And then this year it's jumped up to nearly 30-40%. So all of Trump's Christian advisors in the White House Evangelical Advisory Board are largely Pentecostal, or they might be Methodist, Pentecostal, or Catholic and Pentecostal. So that's what he hears every day is that God is going to open doors and make you win, and whatever happens, you're going to get back in office because God wants it.
I hate to bring this back to... Actually, no, I'd love to bring this back to what I face so often, which is the violence of the topic, because we're all talking about the motivations behind it, but what got this mob's attention was the use of force and violence. If all they did was a normal women's march, Million Man March, Trump rally, stood in a field and shook their fists, none of these headlines would be here. All of this would be a sub-note on page 3 of yet another gathering of 50, 100,000 of Trump supporters, and nothing happened. What was different this time was as much the religion, as much the motivation, as much the reasons, as it was the use of force that, again, we've seen in 2020 became mainstream, and more so got the Black Lives Matters movement in 3 months what would have taken 10 years of lobbying to get that. So I come back to it again. Is this just normal now? Mobs use force and get things done to get attention.
But that's kind of entirely the point. Compared to a Black Lives Matters rally, it was barely violent at all. People are yelling about 1 death, and there's now 4 dead, but this morning it was 1 dead. I had Democrats telling me that a woman was dead and it was the Republicans' fault. The woman was quite literally a Republican protester who was ex-Air Force and had served 4 tours overseas and was seen as a threat by a Secret Service policeman and was shot and passed away. I think compared to your average day in Portland, there is significantly less violence per 1,000 people. There was a little bit of pushing and some pepper spray sprayed. When you think about the Molotov cocktails, the beatings, the people with their heads bashed in the street, this is a very polite protest. But the rhetoric
Again,
around it and the way it's
it wasn't
being
a pre-planned
described.
protest as well, which is the difference. This wasn't a pre-planned kind of marching to the Capitol. It was more just the mob kind of formed their own mind and just started marching forward.
Would you believe I was told this morning there was a website and they all organised it, and then I said, well, can I have a link
No.
to the website? And I'm like, and she's like, yeah, like as far as it being violent, they're very, very polite rioters compared to what we normally see.
And what this shows though is that medical emergencies. So they got shot, sent to hospital in a medical emergency, then died.
I read it as something differently. Seeing the crowd, half of them were geriatric. They were absolutely grey old men who were there with their flags and really was 50-plus crowd.
Yeah.
Half of them were. I read that as 3 guys had heart attacks who were on their 4th stroke. Because if they're called medical emergencies, that's what I read cut through anyway.
I would also make the point that if they wanted to be violent, I think the largest number of people in America that own guns are the Republicans. So they certainly didn't bring their weapons with them.
A cooler filled with a long gun and Molotov cocktails was discovered on Capitol grounds. Let's see if we can find more about this.
Can you... I saw that one. There's no real source for it. It wasn't actually attributed to anyone, and they don't seem to know who owned the van yet.
I think Robert Conte made a brief, which we can probably find out somewhere around here and find out more from him. Coming back to the use of force, we can expect more of this, right? This doesn't just stop here, does it?
Yeah, so again, this shows that the Republicans are becoming not the elected Republicans, I mean membership is becoming increasingly tolerant to more harsh measures to win this election. And that's where General Michael Flynn called on Trump to suspend the Constitution, declare martial law, and rerun elections using the military. And that seems like more and more of a possibility, and it's more and more of what Trump's supporters are calling for.
Well, what's the alternative? We've seen so much. We've seen so much violence happen around the world already. Oh, not just around the world. We'll limit it to the U.S. context. We've seen so much violence happen in the U.S. context as it is. What's the alternative? How do you put the genie back in the bottle once there's been this much of it? To say, oh, be yourself, go and protest, encourage protesters we've seen, but once they do, they take the Capitol, and then the message is, oh, not like that. Protest, but not like that. Be violent, but not like that.
What they're doing is creating a moral differentiation. If you are underprivileged, otherwise beaten by the system, otherwise could be considered someone who didn't get their fair share, go ahead and break the windows of the Starbucks and steal from the till, and it's fine. If you happen to be white American and perceived to have privilege, if you go and raid the White House, raid the Capitol building for a political reason, then you're basically evil on earth. We are creating a moral distinction on the basis of perceived privilege, which is problematic not because it's a set of rules. If you knew exactly what that privilege was, where you had even layers and you could read a rule book that told you, well, if you're white, here's your privilege. If you're black, here's your privilege. If you're black, trans, and female, here's your privilege. If you're black and male, here's your privilege. If you are under a certain income per year, here's your privilege level. And there was a paragraph description of what you're allowed to do in life right next to it. You would have a clear set of definers that would tell you where the new basis of this equity is. When you don't have a rule book, privilege that is based on this floaty moral idea where one person's morality is so much better or so much worse than another's, you actually just kind of end up with moral chaos. It's the emotional mess that you get when you have an unexpected fight with your spouse. It is beating someone up on a playground as a teenager and feeling that rush of excitement as you go to smash someone's nose in. It is that turned into morality. And that's what's terrifying about it. That it's one rule for you and another rule for me, and it's the mob who decides what that is.
Because the incitement to violence or the violence? Because that's what I've put up here, is the incitement to violence, right?
Yeah.
Which is from one side, go on, get out there, make people uncomfortable, push them out of their chairs.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez also told us recently to make a list of every Republican who donated to Trump and make sure their social privileges were taken away. We've done that. We called it McCarthyism.
As long as both sides are doing it, that's fine. The issue is if that we have one guy who incited people to violence, which Donald Trump did incite people to violence, and now we're saying we need to impeach him. Are we impeaching everyone who's inciting people to violence?
So,
I would also
what
make
was
the
the
point-
source for Trump's incitement?
Say that again?
What did Trump incite? Sorry.
He incited people to violence by saying, "Get up there, take back the Capitol, stop the steal of the election." That's incitement to violence, right? Are we now going to impeach people for inciting people to violence?
Probably not.
Well, I don't actually know that he
I mean,
incited people to violence.
The
They pulled it off
first
Twitter.
impeachment already failed. I doubt the second one will work.
The incitement to violence was in a video he posted to his Twitter account. It was removed.
Oh. Remain peaceful, no violence.
So did he actually incite people to violence? We can't tell because he was ripped down off Twitter. So what he said is hard to know.
I haven't seen AOC telling Antifa to stay down, but that's okay. AOC also hasn't said Antifa needs to as well, but I think the upset is that he indirectly incited it. And I can see that. Okay, sure. He
So
got me
has
riled up.
Mayor Ted Wheeler of Portland. So has Nancy Pelosi talking about Black Lives Matter. So has, oh gosh, what was the name of Wheeler's opponent who just lost? The lady who was even more extreme than he was, that was a member of Antifa. I'm pretty sure we could go through the Twitter accounts of most of the active Democrat senators right now and find some level of incitement at some point in the last year. Does it only count if you're doing it or the president is a relevant question.
Yes. Yes, clearly it does.
What do you think, Samrat?
Could you repeat the question again? Sorry.
Does it only matter if you incite people to violence if you're the president? Because plenty of other Democratic and Republican politicians have done the same over the last year.
I think, it applies to everyone. And I don't believe Trump directly incited it, and I haven't seen where he indirectly incited it. He's always frequently, when asked, he's told people to stand down from inciting violence and reinforce the idea that protests need to be peaceful, as opposed to Democrats who never ask Black Lives Matter people to stand down or say protests need to be peaceful.
Which we've seen before. So it's a question there of, well, not even a question. We can fairly say that he incited it, but did he incite the violence? Probably not, but he incited people who led to violence. And then we end up with, where are people culpable? I think we just end up with a position that I look at it, that this has been happening all year. This is nothing new. It only seems to be upset when it affects people's offices, buildings, and positions of wealth and power. And okay, maybe that's the way it's always been in large organizations like it.
Actually, what Samrat has had to say has changed my opinion on what I saw this morning a little bit. I hadn't considered... I knew and understood that after Hillary lost the election in 2016, that the makeup of the Democratic Party had changed, that the Republicans had become a very religious party, and the Democrats kind of became this melange of everything else. When you contextualize that and you think about Kamala Harris standing up and talking about her pronouns and praying to, the prayers to a woman in Congress, that would deeply offend a deeply religious Republican Party.
Yeah.
In many ways, you look at what they're doing, they may think that their defense of President Trump and republicanism is deeply moral, just in the sense of maintaining societal decency, that the rules of the society that they live in within a church have much stronger moral boundaries, and that may actually explain some of the lack of violence in a protest of a very large number of Republicans. That was much less violent than every other left-wing protest I've seen in the US over the last year. They certainly weren't NFAC turning up with their as militia with their guns and marching up the center of a Georgia street, and it certainly seems to me that there may be a deeply moral aspect to what these Republicans who've gone into the Capitol are trying to do, and that they're kind of in a way being very deeply misrepresented.
So this is what a coup would look like. This is what, to me, a coup looks like, is 100, 1,000 armed, young, ideally. Old men don't launch coups. They're bad at it. They get hungry. They need naps all the time. They're not particularly resilient. They can't march too far. You need young, angry men to get that coup going at the base level. After that, that's where you can start to flip the army. You want the generals on your side. But this is how you get it to begin with. This is what it looks like. Or a bunch of these guys. See these guys? You take over a police department and you start there. Or you take up a local army department. You take the establishment or the non-establishment. You need equipment. You need leadership.
A coup is like Augusto Pinochet taking in a military junta and taking over the government and saying, what I says goes. That's definitely not what happened today.
This is a mob. I say mob. And if a mob can launch a coup, then every BLM protest that got to a mayoral office or a government building was a coup. Then the Hong Kongers in the Legislative Council were a coup. And the Chinese needed to put that coup down with force. Right?
Like I said, to me, a coup is something that involves military and weaponry. And for a coup to be a coup, you actually have to be attempting to take over political power. They didn't take out all of the senators they don't agree with and put them in prison after this. There was no murder of people they politically disagreed with. There was no King Trump coming and sitting on the throne and saying, I'm declaring myself the King of America. We have unilaterally undone the democratic system. They want a fresh vote. They want a recount. If you're going for a coup, it's a bit of a crap way of going about it. I mean...
Recount's a big ask. It's a big ask. Failed democracies have recounts.
Well, it is a failed democracy. I don't know if anybody else has noticed.
It is looking that way.
I'm sorry, but I'll be spicy. I'm calling this what it is. Democracy in America has failed just because you call it the Republicans and the Democrats. They have lost their grip on what acceptable political behavior is.
For those just tuning in, this is not an official top-down kind of... This is the way things are. We're all with Samrat on the phone and Edwina just next to me. We're trying to work out what just happened this morning, what it means. Because the headlines are...
A bit trash, to be honest.
Yeah.
You know what really strikes me as different about Republican protests? The people at them appear to be having fun, which is not a general feature of protests that are fundamentally violent. If you look at some of the footage from early in the day before they broke the lines, there is a lot of people laughing and handing out flags and hats, and it's very kind of we're all going to a big party kind of atmosphere. That's not something that I associate with violent protests that are organised either.
And they're not showing the chandelier right in front of them. That should be torn down. That's what is normally with these mobs. What happens is there's abject property damage everywhere, but they're not. African American representation I can see here as well.
The language that I'm hearing people use is that because of these people coming into the Capitol building, they're now ashamed of being American. We are truly making your politics into a moral choice rather than a political one, and I think that is something that's very new to the last year and a half, 2 years. Political choice and moral choice used to be a little bit more separate, but your virtue is now directly connected with what you politically believe, and that is strange and terrifying to me. And I'm sure you've seen more of that, Samrat. I'm not particularly religious, so I don't have the religious aspect to my politics. But seeing people being directly morally judged for their political choices is very interesting to me.
This was one of the senators who he sits in Congress with this rather than a mask because he finds it easier to breathe. It not necessarily judging negatively the look, but it just looks.
Looks like a condom.
Comments
You
from
said
the-
it. Comments from the crowd.
So again, that the what I'm trying to what my perspective is that this is the new normal now. Use of force for it. How far can we take it? So we've got both sides that are into it. It's not going to stop here. How far can they take it until, or is this deserving of a massive crackdown?
I think we'll find out if they descend into civil war on January 20. Will they get out their guns to defend this ideology? That will tell you how far they'll take it.
Civil war.
It depends on if Trump declares martial law, which is an increasingly likely probability.
If he does that, though,
weeks.
Pence will just call the 25th Amendment and call incapacity.
Pence won't do that. Pence doesn't want to do anything beyond what his kind of position requires him to do, which is process, ceremony. And it's very unlikely that. So Pence, at heart, supports the Trump crowd, but then when it comes to process, he doesn't want to kind of overstep anything, which is why he didn't throw out any of the ballots, because he didn't believe that he had the power to do that.
You
So
don't
if
think
Trump
he'd do
does
that
declare
if Trump
martial
called
law-
in the military?
No, because suspending the Constitution will prevent Pence from being able to do that. So martial law is connected with suspending the Constitution, which then deprives Pence of any power.
I don't think Trump has the stomach for a war.
No, I don't think he does.
Are you sure? When you're coming from a group that believes God has ordained your second term, anything becomes a possibility.
That's a good point.
That's true, but isn't Trump himself irreligious and it's just his followers who are religious?
No, Trump. So what I heard from, what was her name? Paula White Kane and Franklin Graham especially, Franklin Graham said this, was that compared to every other Republican president, Trump in private has been the one that's done the most praying and has been the most Christian behind the scenes. So anyone that says Trump is irreligious is just looking at the persona he has to put forward for a religiously diverse country. But behind the scenes, he's absolutely controlled and influenced by the Pentecostal movement.
Yeah.
Do you want a
I mean,
Pentecostal
the fact
church
he's
run
not
America?
conceding at all.
Well, that Pentecostal church has been running.
Much nicer than the Black Lives Matter church.
I think it depends when everyone pulls out the guns where that goes. To me, like what happens on January 20 when they swear in Biden anyway.
I've been waiting for anything to happen on the right because so far they haven't really been turning out. It took Knights of Burning in Kenosha for a group of disorganized militia, including Kyle, to show up, and when they did, it was pretty disorganized. It could have been a lot better.
You know what I always wonder? If Kyle had been standing in a line of other people that thought the same way he did, all holding guns, and they all started firing, if he would be perceived differently.
What I was going to say is that, yes, I absolutely, but this is the first time they've really shown up in force.
That's true.
This is the first time they've really turned out in a, even if it wasn't officially organized, which it kind of, look, there were some stands and what have you. This is the first big rollout of it. And where there's one, there tends to be more, but I just still don't see the hierarchy being created. BLM has seen billions in revenue last year. I don't see after this a big fundraising campaign for everyone is going to be fined.
If they're backed by the churches, they don't need the money. The churches will provide the money. It's a different setup to BLM. But remember, religion in America has been taught to hide the sources of its money after all of the embarrassments with taxation status and everything else. I bet you that a lot of these people will be helped out by the churches they belong to, but it'll be quiet because that's considered unacceptable in the current moral climate.
We've assumed for a long time that a lot of these churches are quiet, peaceful places of worship, but a lot of these, somehow you've brought the religious angle into it that I think we're missing, we're ignoring. If only one of these simple headlines, mob incited by Trump storms Capitol, mob incited by Pelosi, mob incited by McConnell, mob incited by some other leader. Instead, we have mostly peaceful protests. And if I can take a moment to play some of this for a moment, can I?
I just don't even know why there aren't uprisings all over the country, and maybe there will be.
People need to start taking to the streets. This is a dictator.
You know, there needs to be unrest in the streets for as long as there's unrest in our lives.
Enemies of the state.
Show me where it says that protests are supposed to be polite and peaceful.
Do something about your dad's immigration practices, you feckless.
When they go low, we kick.
How do you resist the temptation to run up and wring her neck?
The biggest terror threat in this country is white men, most of them radicalized right up to the right.
I thought he should have punched him in the face. I said, even if you lost, he insulted your wife.
Yes.
He came down the escalator and called Mexicans rapists and murderers. He said, well, what do you think I should have done? I said, I think you should have punched him in the face and then gotten out of the race. You would have been a hero.
I'd like to punch him in the face. I said if we were in high school, I'd take him behind the gym and beat the hell out of him.
Punch some people in the face!
When was the last time an actor assassinated a president?
They're still going to have to go out and put a bullet in Donald Trump, and that's a fact.
Look as his character is stabbed to death.
Where is John Wilkes Booth when you need him?
What?
I have thought an awful lot about blowing up the White House.
A Missouri state senator is under investigation by the Secret Service after saying she hopes President Trump is assassinated.
I will go and take Trump out tonight.
And if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them. And you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere.
And sadly, the domestic enemies to our voting system and our honoring our Constitution are right at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
They're not going to stop before Election Day in November, and they're not going to stop after Election Day. And that should be, everyone should take note of that on both levels, that this isn't, they're not going to let up, and they should not.
If you think we're rallying now, you ain't seen nothing yet.
Heavy, huh? There's something about the vision of angry European Americans, angry old white men and young, that just changes how we feel about it entirely.
Because we've delegitimized men. We've delegitimized men having feelings, opinions, rights in family court, rights to their children, rights in law. ability to have conversations. We've even delegitimized having them as partners. We have taken this cultural stand where men are not worth an ounce of salt, and the internet is sharing that, and we're like, well, you've had privilege for so long, we're going to take our turn. Except we aren't taking our turn, we're taking everything, and that's the distinction that nobody's making. It's not necessarily about beating someone up to get your share, and we no longer think that way. All of those people talking about all of these violent thoughts that they had, why the hell aren't you all going to therapy? Thinking that violently on a daily basis all the time because people don't agree with you is almost its own form of hive mind mental illness.
Yeah, it is. So many Antifa uniforms here. So many of them. They know exactly where to buy them. Same helmets, same hats.
You want organisation? Antifa's organised.
All right. So, violence is part of the general political discourse.
I think we lost Sam right somewhere.
No, I'm here. I'm still here in the background, pondering the moves of Donald Trump over the next 2 weeks. So I can say two things for sure there. The first thing is that Trump will get back into office. He's not going to concede. Coming from a religious background, he believes that God's chosen him for a second term. With that comes a unprecedented level of confidence of which nothing can possibly shake when you have the creator of everything on your side. And secondly, I believe there's a 70% chance that that he'll declare martial law in the next 2 weeks. Either that or some other miraculous thing puts him back in office before that happens.
Then it's up to the generals to follow that order, which they may or may not. And that's where we get to the stage of where people are talking about coups. When the generals start picking sides.
I actually present an alternative future. Trump is taken out of office because he either can't declare martial law or the 25th Amendment is called or Biden is sworn in for some reason. We head 4 years into the future. Joe Biden's a very old man. He has a stroke in office, and Kamala Harris is now president of the United States. Over the next 5 to 10 years, we see an acceleration of the Black Lives Matter movement. We see McCarthy-style lists being made by senators like AOC, where you can be arrested and questioned for wrongthink. You see the average citizen's rights go away as all of the apps they have in their phone track the things that they say online, and then they have polite knocks from the cops on their doorstep saying, we saw you said this and we'd like to talk about it. We believe you're inciting violence. And 15 to 20 years from now, we will have a large population of Americans who are demoralized and truly violent, and they won't be marching into the Capitol with masks on waving happy flags. They'll be marching in with guns because they're sick of being underprivileged, underappreciated, and working as the backbone of the American economy and being treated like absolute dirt by the political establishment. The reality is the Democratic Party treats the Republicans like they're stupid rednecks who belong to the Corn Belt and shouldn't be allowed to have an opinion. That will eventually have an effect on those people where they get sick of the contempt.
Threats that aren't backed up with the use of force are hollow, empty. Unless you use violence, it's clearly... That's what BLM proved.
It can take us a while to get there. We've been taught for the last 20 to 30 years that Western white culture, men are bad, men are violent, men should be put on sertraline antidepressants so they don't hit their wives, that the ultimate outcome of being a man is that you'll have a dissatisfying life because you can only go so far and your children can be taken from you. There is only so many years of this kind of culture that doesn't have a rapid backlash. I don't believe you can maintain that kind of pressure on individuals that make them worth less than nothing and have there be no outcome. And I'm not saying that necessarily means that outcome will be war, but I do believe you can't crush an entire segment of society and expect that there will be no outcome from that eventually.
The anti-communist Drew Pavlov said that the difference is that when the Hong Kongers occupied the Legislative Council, it was to support democracy, and that the Trumpists are there to support a dictator.
Again, that's just a moral judgment on politics.
Yes.
There's literally no difference but whether you like them or not. And when we make decisions about these things on whether we like someone, it becomes a bit of a mess, doesn't it?
And Samrat, you've given the perspective that it's about when morals become religion, where at least something can be, you've got some kind of group.
It's kind of codified.
Yeah, codified.
The religious people I know aren't necessarily, I don't look at them and go, you're the best people I know, but they are the most consistent.
Yeah.
Because they have a set of life rules that they live by, and that's just how it is.
Because what's good to you, and what's good to Samrat, and what's good to me, and what's good to someone else, and what's good to Trump.
What worries me if the churches turn around and say, stand up, it's time to be a soldier of God. You could imagine that recreating rather a little bit of mess.
Okay.
I think violence is the new normal.
Yeah.
And I think that we ignore it because it makes us uncomfortable.
We've certainly forgotten that this isn't the first time violence has happened. 1954. Here's a cool one from the pages of history. 30 rounds from the ladies' gallery into the House of Representatives. 5 injured. The Puerto Ricans wanted independence.
Well, I'd like to make the point that at a fully Republican protest, the only people that died today were Republicans.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Did they die? Nope.
I would like to make the point that it's not as if these protesters walked into the Congress and shot Nancy Pelosi.
Check it out. They were pardoned and returned to Puerto Rico. There you go.
That said, Jimmy Carter was such an interesting president. He was so deeply unpopular for having that recession, and they needed it. He was a peanut farmer, wasn't he?
He was. Right.
I think maybe America really did need a Republican president, just perhaps maybe not Trump.
Who's going to be the next leader of it? Ted Cruz, perhaps?
I don't know. I look at both parties and they're a mess. Sorry?
I was just laughing when you said Ted Cruz.
Why not?
Ted Cruz's popularity only skyrocketed once he allied himself with Trump after the 2016 elections.
The problem with Ted Cruz is whenever he speaks, he always seems like he's not exactly sure. That's not a great trait as a speaker for a president.
Coming back to on a more closer to home issue of what this means for our protests on January 26th, I don't think that they'll be. I think this will actually reduce their intensity, increase their number, but reduce their intensity. I think Invasion Day will be smaller in fire, but larger in number.
I think it'll be that because this has happened, anyone who turns up on the side of it being Australia Day, they'll just laugh us out of the room of being right-wing nuts. So they'll laugh at it rather than creating a scene.
And the far right's just going to go further right. They're going to dive even further into the awful...
To be fair, fortunately, the Australian far right isn't that right. I know everyone rants about them being very right. They're not particularly right compared to the far right, for example, in America. But by and large, I just think that it will continue to grow as a source of dissatisfaction rather than political will. So the Australian right will be made up of people who end up there because they're dissatisfied with the alternative, not necessarily because it was their politics in the first place. And that can be a lot more dangerous. Movements made up of people that feel like they're abandoned by society become things like BLM. They become things like the radical trans movement. They become things like people who are willing to hit someone to win. And that's what concerns me, that it's becoming not about politics, just about anything but that. And that's the change, I think, that I see. What a delightful conversation, gentlemen.
No, this is good. This was helpful for me just to try and work out what's happened this morning. I hope some of watching along at home, it's been a big day there as well.
Thank you for joining us, Samrat.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
I would have had no idea about
problem.
the religious aspect. Yeah. I'm going to go and read about Pentecostal churches now.
I think you'll find that, yeah, I mean, take Hillsong, for example. Hillsong came from Assemblies of God Australia. They came from Assemblies of God USA. All the Pentecostal churches can be narrowed down in origin to what's called the Azusa Street Revival, where a group of churchgoers in Azusa Street suddenly came down with a revitalized spiritual connection to God, and then from that point, 200 million Christians now Pentecostal.
Huh. I'm going to message you for some sources because I need to know more now.
Yeah.
And that stirred off the new... Cool.
So it's quite a phenomenal thing in the sense that from a religious perspective, its explosive growth is used to kind of be like, hey, look how much this movement has grown to the point where 1/4 of all Catholics are now charismatic as well. It must actually be a revival by God. And that's why, although Christianity in general is on decline, Pentecostal churches are on the rise.
When people feel abandoned, they can easily abandon civilized restraint. What do you reckon?
Yeah.
We've been going an hour. That's a good unpack for me. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your time.
Yes, definitely. I'm
Brilliant.
going to message you for some things to read because I need to know more now.
Yeah.
No, just discussion. All right, let's leave it there. Thanks, Samrat.
All right, catch you later.
See ya.
Later.
Bye, everyone.